Oh.
Ask the audience to move in so I can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, please move in if you want. Have a seat in the front.
So please, there's lots of seats at the front, so please everybody, and anybody who's sitting on the edge of rows, please squidge in, because this is going to be a packed house, young man.
Yeah.
Ah, there you go.
Great. Well, it's welcome to the last talk of Breaking Convention. Well done on making it so far. I am personally exhausted. I've been sick for the whole conference and just only getting better now, but hopefully we have a nice time together. So my name is Chris. I'm a person who's fascinated by the mind. My primary realm of fascination has always been consciousness. And this is what has drawn me to psychedelics and now a bit more with meditation. And so what I will talk about you today is really some of the things that I have learned from the point of view of consciousness research and how these things apply to some of the challenges that right now we face in the field, in the scientific field of consciousness research, where we can learn about the mind and the brain via the use of psychedelics, but also their implementation in practice, right? And so what I'm going to propose is a bit of an insight from the contemplative approaches of how to navigate some of these tensions, some of these difficulties from middle way perspective. All right. And so following the talk by my good friend Ido, I'd like to start with a little provocation that I think that the great opportunities why we are enchanted by psychedelics and the great difficulties and challenges related to psychedelics are fundamentally rooted in deep metaphysical problems that cannot be resolved. And so what does this mean? We are enchanted by psychedelics because they produce this form of alchemy, where you have a natural organic substance, something in the material world out there, that it induces this incredible, subjective, ineffable, intimate experience in here. And so it provides this bridge of sorts to explore this very deep connection of the mind-body problem. At the same time, this is at the root of the challenges on how we're thinking and validating the implementation of psychedelic drugs. And so the fundamental tension of psychedelic and their implementations, psychedelics and their implementation, fundamentally relate in the ways that we generate and validate knowledge about them. On the one hand, one extreme of that is the first-person perspective related to subjective experience. I've had an experience that has been transformative, that only I can know in the ultimate, intimate, subjective sense. And on the other hand, you have this third-person knowledge about how these molecules act in the brain, act in the body, induce these neuroplastic effects, and so on and so forth. And so how does this express right now in the most obvious of ways? Ido just talked about it. On the one hand, you have the team that proposes that the beneficial effects of psychedelics are due to their intimate subjective effects in the first person. And then you have the opposing team that says, well, we can somehow do away with subjective experience. We can strip the molecules out of this subjective richness, the uncomfortable things of first-person experience, and leave these third-person effects of neuroplasticity. And if we do that, we can safely deploy this at an institutional level and save ourselves a lot of trouble, right? And having therapist support, sit and setting support, so forth and so on. This tension is also expressed in the way that we do psychedelics. We do the practice of psychedelics, I would say. We have the transpersonal approaches, for example, to psychedelics that I think very much embody at times, not always, but many times, the extreme of the first-person means of validation of knowledge, where you have a first-person experience and a validation of that as the primary source of what is valuable in the psychedelic experience. And so if you've visited other realms, if you've had an experience of insight, or if you've somehow visited your traumatic childhood memory, that is a real thing. That is a truthful thing that you had. And that can also lead to a range of problems that we'll see in a bit. And on the other hand, in the implementations, you have, again, what Ido was talking about, the perspective that you can somehow develop these novel molecules where all that matters, really, at its extreme, is that we can reduce all these complexities that we talk about in the first person and bring it to the brain. And so we have, on the one hand, experience reductionism, and on the other hand, some form of neuronal reductionism. And so I would argue that this tension is very much also at the roots of the little crisis that the field encountered in the middle of last year. One of the central problems that happened in the FDA advisory board when it came to legalizing MDMA was precisely about, well, are we legalizing some form of drug or a form of therapy? The FDA regulates drugs. It doesn't regulate implementations of therapy and management of this intimate subjective experience. And the other issue that was framed is the elements related to expectancy and blinding. These confounding factors that were perceived as something that was blocking the way that we can validate whether or not these are meaningful medicines. Right? Expectancy and unblinding have to do with the way that we ascribe meaning to these medical interventions. They relate to subjective experience, and therefore they're treating as noise in the process of validation rather than signal. And so the argument that I'd like to propose is that these things cannot be resolved. These are fundamental issues related to ontology, the question of what is real, and more specifically is very much connected to the hard problem of consciousness. The impossibility that we have right now in somehow translating the intimate subjective qualities of human experience and consciousness in third-person, hardcore, naturalistic facts about the brain. And so the proposal here is that this cannot be solved, is an uncomfortable truth that is also very much at the roots of our existential tribulations of human beings. This is the very stuff of life. We cannot really avoid these issues. We can only navigate this tension. And so the proposal of this talk is how can we maybe do this navigation in the ways that we do science and the ways that we do practice. And so how can we do this in the way that we do science, in the way that we do psychedelic research? And the proposal is to invite the richness of subjective experience in the way that we do science or neuroscience. And so the proposal that we developed a few years ago is this neurophenomenological approach to altered states of consciousness, non-ordinary states of consciousness, where we try to go against the conventional approach, where you have the richness of subjective experience, and the conventional approach in neuroscience, our epistemic sort of assumptions, is that you can somehow reduce the dynamic and richness of that subjective experience into patterns of brain activity. Our proposal is that rather than try to reduce these things, is to acknowledge both subjective experience and brain activity in equal terms. And this also implies to develop novel methods that somehow develop rigorous approaches to the ways that we understand subjective experience and the richness of subjective experiences, and the way that we understand the brain also from that perspective. And I'd like to do a bit of a nod that a big part of this approach is very much inspired by the tradition of psychonautics and trip reports. The very careful and detailed investigation of first-person subjective experience and treating that first-person subjective experience as valid forms of data that can somehow tell us how these molecules are acting in the brain and the mind. Okay, so why are psychedelics meaningful, in my opinion, when it comes to consciousness research and mental health research? A little detour into some of the things that we find and how they can bind in together to the main aims of the talk. The main proposal is that psychedelics might be meaningful. We care about these is because they modulate fundamental structures of experience. They deconstruct and they reconstruct these structures of experience. And by doing so, they afford novel opportunities of meaning, novel opportunities of meaning making. And that can transform lives and can help us also understand our minds in a deeper way. And so this could enable us to study some fundamental aspects of the brain and mind on one hand, as well as develop the use of psychedelics to foster mental health, human flourishing, all these things that we care about. And so what is exactly deconstructed and reconstructed in the psychedelic experience? Perception, visual imagery is a classic example of how the world out there is transformed and restructured in novel ways. Language and thought, the way that thought is dramatically altered or can be even dramatically deconstructed to a point of an experience feeling ineffable. We also have a range of neuroimaging data showing how the language systems of the brain become particularly dysregulated in the psychedelic experience. The sense of self is the classic example of what becomes deconstructed in a psychedelic experience, but also after the psychedelic experience, how the patterns of the self can become rearranged or reconstructed in meaningful ways for purposes many times of mental health or human development. Social relations, the work of Leo Roseman and Hannes Gedner, for example, has shown how experiences of communitas, new social arrangements can develop during a psychedelic experience as well as after the psychedelic experience. Beliefs, some of the work that we've done showing how worldviews and metaphysical views, what the nature of reality can be dramatically altered, shifting convictions away from physicalism or a materialistic perspective of consciousness towards a panpsychist view. And then finally, of course, cultural norms, being the countercultural revolutions of the 60s and the role that psychedelics played in that as a prime example of how these forms of deconstruction and reconstruction reach variety levels of abstraction. And so how have we studied this phenomena of deconstruction and reconstruction? Primarily by employing some of the most powerful experiences we can induce now in the lab with the use of 5-MeO-DMT as a prime example of almost complete deconstruction of human experience, and DMT as an opportunity to study how we build novel worlds of experience and meaning in the psychedelic state. And so this is some of the work that we've done together with James Sanders. He gave a talk yesterday about the 5-MeO-DMT experience and how we noted, for example, that in certain participants, at the peak of that 5-MeO-DMT experience, participants reached the state of everything and nothing happening at the same time. Where in this qualitative analysis, when we invited the richness of subjective experience via these phenomenological methods, we were able to capture experiences of no space, no time, almost no distinctions in experience, no subject-object distinctions, and no other features of the sense of self. Here's a quote from one participant in that experience. I was not there. It was like I was accessing whiteness, quiet, blissful, enormous whiteness. I was everything. There was no controller, no observer. It was not me who was having the experience. I don't know what happened. I somehow had a glimpse of the wholeness. So in this experience, usually participants reported as well, not a kind of boring sort of absence of experience, but rather an experience that is so filled with possibilities that no distinctions are possible, similar to watching kind of like a screen static in the television. However, importantly, I'd like to mention that yes, we found a state of deconstructed consciousness. As a consciousness researcher, this is extremely exciting, the possibility of accessing some form of fundamental bedrock of human experience, or this is at least maybe our current delusions about what we're getting at. But we also, important to mention that we found this only for 30% of participants, and we found a great deal in the varieties of human experience when we studied this in a controlled fashion. We did some preliminary analysis on what was happening in the brain in the state of supposed deconstruction, and we found that 5-MeO-DMT generated this global reduction of this inhibitory brain wave. And so a state of disinhibition in terms of brain activity. And there's other research that was also presented in this conference by George Blackburn showing how 5-MeO-DMT was also linked to more diverse and less recurrent forms of brain function. So we have a situation where we have this state of supposed deconstruction of human experience. However, this appears to be linked to some form of disinhibited, more fluid forms of brain function. So how can this be? It seems it's somewhat incoherent. So let's look at the current simplified, uber simplified model of what I think is going on. We can think of the mind and the brain as this system that with a certain amount of temperature, the right critical amount of temperature, the mind is able to make specific distinctions in objects in human experience. A critical temperature where you would have habitual experience, you're able to somehow see things in the environment, make gestalts and objects in your perception, have a sense of self, so on and so forth. If you reduce the temperature in the system and the brain activity becomes extremely organized, more boring, with less stuff going on, what you have is an absence of human experience. And this is what the evidence shows. When we are in a state of dreamless sleep or unconsciousness because of anesthesia, we find that the brain indeed gets more boring. There's less stuff going on overall. And so the intuition could be that somehow the 5-MeO-DMT state is operating in between these two states, right? An experience of awareness mostly, but nothing else. But instead, the data shows that we have the opposite direction, an increase in temperature, an increase in disinhibition, or almost entropy, if you will. And so the idea would be that this state of everything and nothing would be related to the state of very global disinhibition, an experience that is pregnant with possibilities, or as philosopher Thomas Metzinger says, a state of epistemic openness. I think a term from the Buddhist tradition that I find particularly interesting is sunyata, the idea of a fertile void, an experience where people feel that everything is somehow at the reach in terms of conscious experience, but nothing really fundamentally materializes. And so based in this apparent similarity between these states of consciousness in 5-MeO-DMT state and meditation, we actually had an advanced meditator in the lab. We had a Lama with over 20 years of retreat experience. We administered 2 doses of 5-MeO-DMT, captured his brain activity, interviewed him at depth to try to gain some sort of understanding of whether or not we are tapping into some core fundamental state of the mind or core fundamental state of the brain. This is kind of like our quest. And we found that indeed there were several features of experiences that were similar in both the 5-MeO-DMT state as well as the state of advanced meditation, such as no space, no time, no perceptual center. There's also a range of other stuff. We're working on this right now. But also we found that there were differences. And curiously enough, the meditator recognized the 5-MeO-DMT state as a state of nyam, which I'm not an advanced meditator, but my understanding is that it's like a state of hedonic properties where people feel that they're somehow entering the state of non-duality and become enchanted by it and want to stay there, but that somehow is also considered as some form of pitfall in the practice, a hindrance in the practice. And the meditator did not recognize the non-dual state as being the same as the 5-MeO-DMT state. So we're trying to make sense of this, but it really gives us a sense of the overlaps and differences between these different states of consciousness. When it comes to the brain, and you don't have to really look too much into this, the only thing that matters is that we found that the 5-MeO-DMT state was similar to the non-dual experience in terms of brain activity, but only in the lower doses, not in the higher doses. So this is preliminary findings, and we're looking forward to do this with more advanced meditators so that we can get a better sense of what is going on. All right, great. And so this is when it comes to deconstruction. How about reconstruction? We've employed mostly DMT to understand the ways that we build our worlds of experience, not only the psychedelic worlds of experience, but also the worlds that are part of our ordinary human experience. And the way that we've done that in the past is by giving a quick injection of DMT. It's very similar to when people are smoking DMT and they have this immersive experience and they encounter these entities, and all this interesting stuff is happening just in a fraction of a minute. And we've expanded this administration to 30 minutes so that we can keep people in that DMT peak state with a proper degree of exploration. And by incorporating these phenomenological methods, these first-person approaches, is that we were then able to ask people in real time whether or not they were having an entity experience, yes or no. So some people gave us ratings of entities at some point, other people gave us rating at different points, and so on and so forth. And so really giving us this unique opportunity to capture the brain when people are having these DMT states, immersed in this other world of experience without entities, where we find these increases in entropy, a global state of disinhibition in the brain. And we found that when people encountered the entity and came back and says, yes, I'm having the entity encounter, we looked at the brain, we find that the brain crystallizes back into some form of organization. So the disinhibition, sort of hyperfluid state, then shapes back into some form of order, which also matches what we're finding in our other studies where we find that there's specific brain systems related to social cognition and relationality that are activated when individuals are having these entity encounters. All right, so how do we integrate this in our model? So if the 5-MeO DMT state is a state where we've increased the volume in our mind and in our brains to a capacity that we cannot make any distinctions in experience, what I think is happening in this DMT state is that there's a form of dynamic where the system, the mind and the brain, are somehow beginning to crystallize patterns within the experience, from disorder to states of order, the specific entity encounters that we're talking about. And so I think this is a good example of how when we incorporate lived experience, in our case, asking participants in real time whether or not you're having an entity encounter, a very simple way to incorporate lived experience, we can make much better assumptions about what we're learning about the psychedelic state. We are able to honor human experience in a better way and understand how the brain relates to that. And so if I am an investigator, a researcher, and I try to understand what is going on, and I look at the whole experience and average out over that whole experience and look at the brain state, I would tend to think, well, that's just an increase in entropy. In this state of maximal entropy, you will have all these weird kind of experiences and so on and so forth. But if I invite lived experience in the way that I do science, I can have a much better distinction of what is signal and what is noise. I can learn better about these states and honor them better. I'd also like to mention that, and I am guilty of this, in this sort of quest of understanding the nature of human mind and this ambitious thing, whatever it really is. And also many times I think we find this in the ways that we talk about the psychedelic state and we do science about the psychedelic state. We have like this implicit pyramid model in a way, where we have a research agenda, where we have these ordinary experiences at the base, we have the altered states in the middle, and then at the peak of that, we have like this access to source, right? And I think what we're learning, the more and more we invite the richness of subjective experience in the ways that we do science, is that we find that these experiences have strong overlaps, but also strong differences. And what really is happening is that we're starting to honor the fact that there's a great diversity and richness in human possibility, and that these different molecules somehow show us these diversities. And within that diversity, also ordinary experiences. I think one of the greatest possibilities and remedies to psychedelic exceptionalism is exceptionalizing ordinary experiences as well, and understanding the ways that psychedelic experiences teach us about our habitual experiences. All right. So how do we then move into practice? How do we navigate this unresolvable metaphysical tension, ontological tension about the way that psychedelics work? My proposal is to invite some form of subjective awareness or objectivity, and I'll clarify this in a second, in the ways that we practice psychedelics. And so in this process of deconstruction and reconstruction and the novel affordance of meaning, this fluidity of meaning, we encounter potential pitfalls in what happens in the psychedelic experience. And so we've heard a couple of talks talking about these pitfalls. On the one hand, this ontological shock experience, where the psychedelic experience somehow confronts two individuals to a new reality, a new hidden reality that they were unaware of. Troubling insights, we see this a lot in the context of psychedelic therapy, with the occurrence of potential false memories that can arise in the psychedelic experience. Forms of so-called spiritual bypassing, where there's maybe an over-glorification of spiritual realms that can somehow get in the way of people who want to work on personal issues, relational issues, and so on and so forth, literally becoming a bit ungrounded at times. And of course, the possibility of conspiratorial thinking that can arise following the use of psychedelics. So this is from the point of view of the pitfalls. So the opportunities of this affordance of meaning, of the deconstruction and reconstruction of the mind that then affords novel opportunities of meaning, the opposite would be this form of subjective awareness, an enhanced sense of realizing that we are conscious, incomplete, open-ended beings of awareness. So by deconstructing our usual way of experiencing the world, we can become aware of how we're experiencing the world. And so this transition is what is called in the field of philosophical phenomenology, the transition from the natural, naive attitude of taking for granted the reality of our perceptions of the world and of ourselves to a phenomenological attitude where we bracket out that naive way of understanding. In mental health, this transition can be well exemplified from a form of cognitive fusion where I am fused, my sense of self is fused with maladaptive thought patterns and beliefs, to a form of diffusion, to where I gain a sense of perspective about these thought patterns. In essence, a transition from a form of naive realism about my own mind to a form of subjective awareness. Another way in which this tension is navigated, I think, in skillful psychedelic practice is in the awareness of the dynamics of meaning making. So the evidence seems to propose more and more and more, the way that Ido showed, that the subjective effects induced by psychedelics, these cathartic, spiritual, or insightful experiences appear to predict these mental health outcomes. I think a big part of the story that is missing is how these things are changing over time. The idea that the experience comes and goes in waves. There's these experiences of deconstruction that are peaking and that then are receding back into some form of meaning making, and people are learning and then they go back into that peak again, really speaks about these opportunities where skillful guides or therapists can operate. Another aspect in which we can navigate this tension is by recognizing the extended qualities of subjective experience or consciousness. The relational modes of experiencing, and this is what we call with some colleagues this idea of psychedelic apprenticeship, recognizing that the psychedelic experience is not this passive thing that we have, but this actual active and can be actually quite skillful practice that also can be approached from the point of view of embodying lineages of practice that have generational forms of learning. In this, we identify the idea of the second person, this form of empathic resonance of the role of the guide or the therapist, that in essence can scaffold these dynamic forms of meaning making for the opportunities that psychedelics can provide. And we find more and more evidence that these relational forms, these extended mind elements in the psychedelic therapy are also very much predictive in their therapeutic outcomes. Another element is the embedded qualities of subjective experience, the role of the context, the awareness of the many contexts that mediate the psychedelic experience, set and setting, and so forth and so on. I'm sure all of you are very much aware. And in fact, one of the really fascinating insights that we've had in recent times when it comes to the neuroscience of psychedelics is that the systems of the brain that are particularly sensitive to psychedelic action are the systems of the brain that are more susceptible to the influence of context in our lives, the cultural systems of our brain. Another way that we can navigate this in practice is by recognizing the embodied qualities of subjective experience or the bodily context. We've done some research showing that, for example, the specific coactivation of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic system appears to predict mystical type experiences and can predict effects in well-being. And I think a dramatically overlooked element that I think is absolutely fundamental for their implementation in mental health or uses in creativity or other forms of human development relate to the enacted qualities of the subjective experience. I like to think more and more about this dynamics of deconstruction and reconstruction as what is happening when the participant or a person is learning how to surf. When you're learning how to surf, you're confronted to this unstructured form of information in the waves, where it's very difficult to tell apart what is a good wave to catch, what is a dangerous wave to catch, and so forth and so on. So I would argue that good psychedelic practice is all about understanding how to learn the signal from the noise. What is a worth trip or part of the trip to go on to? What is a good wave to catch? And I am particularly interested right now in understanding the roles of cognition that might be that we might be overlooking when we're thinking about psychedelic practice. Specifically, the role of attention during psychedelic practice. The ways that we deploy our attentional systems or metacognition, thinking about thinking, or even agency. I think our current model of psychedelic practice, this wrapped around this idea of letting go, this black box of surrendering, of which we know very little about. Introducing a proper phenomenological approach, I think, could help dramatically in understanding this in the way that we do practice. And I think there's a lot about the flow state, or what has been written about the flow state, that I think could be quite useful in understanding this. Just all about the control of attention. And so to wrap things up, how is it that we navigate this tension in psychedelic medicine? This is very resonant with Ali's talk, Ali Beiner's talk, if you were there. Is this recognition that experience is embodied, embedded in context, enacted in forms of skillful practice, and extended in human relationships. And the complicated thing is that all these systems are always interacting in multiple non-linear ways to afford opportunities of meaning. And to end with another provocation, well, if meaning matters, then what do we do with the placebo effect? The placebo effect, according to some authors, is all about the ways that we ascribe meaning to specific medical interventions. In the current models of approval or validation of a specific medicine, we want to do away with the placebo effect. I think we have sufficient evidence to start to recognize that the placebo effect synergizes with the psychedelic experience in a variety of ways. And we need to start thinking about how to incorporate in the ways that we do also health and science. And so to end, a reminder that this tension between experience reductionism and neural reductionism is really unsolvable, according from my perspective, what we know at this moment. And so therefore the invitations that psychedelics provide in the way that we do science, in the way that we do health, in the way that we do experience in its many capacities, is all about navigating this fundamental tension, this second person approach, this middle way. So that's it. Thank you for your attention.